Hi everybody, it's Linda, and as you know, I have such interesting friends, and today I'm introducing you to Ness. Anne is from, well, I'll let her tell you where she's from.
Hello there. I'm originally from Portland, Oregon, but have been fortunate to have spent the last year here in Hadano, and will be moving back to the States on Saturday. So looking forward to going home, but no, we will miss all our friends and our opportunities here in Japan.
So let's talk a little bit about your where you are from, because you live in Portland now, but you actually have had a really interesting life in that you've lived in a lot of different parts of the United States. So just talk a little bit about the different parts of the country where you have lived, and when you were there.
Okay. I was born and raised in Colorado. I went to university there. And then after graduating from university in 1977, I went to Salt Lake City, Utah for my first teaching job. And it was there that I met my husband, Eric. I moved to Illinois in the Chicago area, and Eric got his PhD at Northwestern, so we spent 5 years in Illinois. And after his graduation, we moved to Michigan for his first real job. And we lived in Midland, Michigan, which is the middle of the state. And I got a teaching job there in Saginaw, Michigan, which is part of the automobile corridor in Michigan. And at that time, Saginaw was starting to go through the progression of losing automobile jobs. And so economically and socially it was changing, and I had the opportunity to teach in an inner city school, inner city junior high. And by far that was my favorite teaching opportunity. I worked primarily in a minority school with some fabulous children. They had some real obstacles as far as living in poverty and just kind of living within that minority kind of culture. But by far it was my favorite teaching position. I love that. And after 7 years in Michigan, we wanted to get back west towards our families. And Eric had an opportunity to take a position in the Portland, Oregon area. So we moved there in 1995. So that has been our home by far the longest.
You told me before that before you became a teacher, you wanted to study geology. But the thing that surprised me was that when you couldn't be a geologist, you became a special ed teacher. And it's like, oh, well, that's not really like a natural. That's not a natural progression.
They're not related.
How did you get from geology to special ed? What was that progression?
Okay, I think I fell into geology just because of how I grew up. I grew up climbing rocks with my brother and being out of doors, and it was just kind of an interest. So when I started school, you have to take some, general classes. Mm-hmm. So I took geology and just really loved it, and I thought, well, I could, I'll go that route. But then my sophomore year, I had to start getting into some higher level math, and that was very difficult for me. My math background was not strong, so I thought, well, maybe I need to be a little more practical. And backtracking a little bit, in junior high and high school, I babysat, for several families. Mm-hmm. And one family was the grandparents of a young boy and my father worked with this man. And when his grandson came to visit, he asked if I would babysit. And I was. He was a beautiful young boy. He was 6 or 7 months old. And then the next summer they came back and they asked me to babysit again, but they let me know that the situation had changed. He had contracted spinal meningitis, and because of that had some permanent brain damage.
Oh.
So I went from babysitting this delightful young boy, typical, neurotypical, to then now having lifelong handicaps because of his exposure. And I just loved that little boy. And I was able to spend actually quite a bit of time with him over the summer. And he really kind of piqued my interest in working with kids. So going back and rethinking, well, maybe geology is more my hobby than a career choice. I thought back to my interest in children, and so I thought, well, I'll give special education a try. So,
And you said that when you were in Michigan, inner city, and was that also special ed?
yes,
Oh,
yeah,
okay.
I've always taught just special education. So those kids had a variety of different delays, from communication disorders to learning disabilities to emotional. So I kind of had a wide range of kids. So my students that were identified as special ed were in the same class as regular students, and then I would team teach.
And I know that that's an issue today. A friend of
Yes.
mine has a special needs child, and here in Japan, both of my children had special needs children in their classes. I mean, integration is important, but there are also problems that are associated with integration.
I think children with delays or disabilities are a part of our society, and so they have. I firmly believe that they have a right to develop to their full potential, whatever that is. There are some kids whose delays or disabilities are so significant that being in a regular classroom really does not serve a purpose, because what they need is so much more involved than what can be provided in what we would call a typical classroom. But we have many, many students who are identified as special or having a special education need. And oftentimes the thought is we don't assume that their competency. We always look, well, they have a delay, so I wouldn't use the word incompetent, but we're not assuming that they have this level of competency. So my philosophy has always been to look for the competency level of every child. And that really hit home when I started to work with children who had cerebral palsy. And those are the children that are motorically very involved, and their speech is very involved. And usually those are the two main areas that are affected with cerebral palsy. It's their motor and their speech, but not their intellect. But because they can't speak and they can't move, we assume intellectually that they're not typical. And I've had several students who were incredibly bright, but because they couldn't communicate or they couldn't physically become involved in activities, that they were left out. And so
when you say they were left out, you mean left out of the classroom, or
left
you mean left behind in society in general?
And both. They were not included in a regular classroom. They were assumed that they needed total special education, but intellectually they were very typical. And so they would have benefited by being in a regular classroom with some accommodations to help them communicate or to help them physically maneuver around the classroom. But, there again, we weren't assuming their competence.
While we're on the subject of your work with children, I just learned the other night, when you go back to the United States, you're going to continue volunteering for a program that you had done before you came here. And that too is really unique, and I think it's worth talking about. So if you can talk about that a little bit.
Yes. In my teaching career, I had many children that were in the foster care system, and I worked a lot with foster parents, with their birth parents, But I also had the opportunity to work with people who are involved in what is called a court-appointed special advocacy program. And you are a volunteer, and you are actually the legal advocate for a child that's in foster care. And so you go through quite intensive training, and then once you've been through your training, you are appointed by a judge. You're asked to be by a judge to be the legal advocate for a child in foster care. So in the state of Oregon, we are mandated to find a new placement for a child or to reunite them with their birth parents within a 2-year period. My first case was a young boy and his little sister who were taken from their parents. The father was incarcerated, and mom got involved in using drugs, and the children it was determined that she was neglectful, so they were taken from her and placed into foster care. So the judge determined they needed a CASA, a court-appointed special advocate, so I was assigned. So what I do is I get involved with the foster parent, I get involved with the birth parents, I get involved in the children's school, I go to parent conferences, I go to doctor's appointments, I go to their mental health therapy appointments. I get involved in every aspect of the child's life.
Are you doing this with the child? Like, so when you go to the parent-teacher meeting, is it with the child? If you go to the healthcare specialist, is it with the child, or is this separate?
If it's just a parent-teacher conference and the children aren't involved, I go with the foster parent or the birth mom. I did attend their mental health sessions. I did have the opportunity to talk with their therapist afterwards. I was able to talk to their doctor because the child, if they have some medical issues, I have the legal, because I am a legal representative, I have the legal obligation, or I am allowed to have access to all of those. So my job really is not to become like a big sister or a big brother to the children. It's more to understand all their needs and to make sure their needs are being met. And it's really, I'm operating in what is best interest of the child. So when the foster parent or the birth parent needs to go to court to determine whether or not they're making progress, so I stand up in court and give testimony. And at the end of 12 months, we determine whether or not the birth parents have made enough progress to have the children reunited with them, or we say no, that the parent rights need to be terminated. And then that child's put up for adoption.